A poor widow was sold to a hell's angel by her own father as punishment. He said it was to teach her obedience. But what she found wasn't hell. It was something far more shocking. Alone with her little boy, she's sent to live with a man the whole town fears, a man they call the devil on a bike. He's scarred, silent, and dangerous, or so everyone says. But when he offers her kindness instead of cruelty, her faith begins to stir again. Just when hope returns, her father comes back, with threats that could destroy everything she's rebuilt. And in the middle of fire, faith, and small-town gossip, the widow must choose, obey fear or fight for love. Because sometimes, the one you were sold to might just be the one sent to save your soul. What happens when punishment turns into a miracle and grace walks straight out of the ashes? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across Grace Delaney's worn kitchen counter as she counted the meager pile of bills for the third time. Her hands trembled slightly, knowing what would happen when her father discovered the bounced check. $20 for Luke's school lunches hadn't seemed like much, but it was enough to upset the delicate balance of her finances. "Mommy?" Luke's small voice broke through her worried thoughts. "Are we going to be late for church?" Grace looked up at her 8-year-old son, his blue eyes bright with innocent concern. He stood there in his Sunday best, the second-hand dress shirt slightly too big for his thin frame. Her heart squeezed with love and worry. "No, sweetheart," she managed a gentle smile. "Go get your shoes on." The walk to church was short, but felt endless. Grace's stomach churned with each step toward the white wooden building that had once been her sanctuary. Now it loomed before her like a stern judge, much like her father himself. Inside, the familiar scent of old hymnals and wooden pews did nothing to calm her nerves. She guided Luke to their usual spot in the front row, where her father insisted they sit. Reverend Silas Delaney stood at the pulpit, his gray hair neatly combed, his black suit pressed to perfection. But Grace knew better than to trust the polished exterior. The service proceeded normally until the announcements. Grace's heart stopped when her father cleared his throat, his stern gaze fixing directly on her. "It grieves me to address a matter of grave concern," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the small sanctuary. "When members of our congregation fail to honor their commitments to God's house, it reflects a deeper spiritual failing." Grace felt the color drain from her face as dozens of eyes turned toward her. Luke pressed closer to her side, sensing her distress. "My own daughter," Reverend Silas continued, his voice heavy with manufactured sorrow, "has shown herself to be a burden and disgrace to God. Her monthly tithe check was returned for insufficient funds." Whispers rippled through the congregation. Grace wanted to sink through the floor, but forced herself to sit straight, even as tears burned behind her eyes. "Father, please," she spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I needed to pay for Luke's school." "Silence!" The word cracked like a whip. "Your excuses only compound your shame." Luke's small hand slipped into hers, and she squeezed it gently, trying to shield him from the heavy weight of judgment pressing down on them both. The rest of the service passed in a blur of hymns and prayers that felt hollow and cold. Afterward, Grace hurried Luke home, avoiding the pitying looks and whispered conversations that followed them down the church steps. Evening brought no peace. The small dining room felt suffocating as they sat down to supper. The only sound the quiet clink of spoons against bowls of thin soup. Reverend Silas sat at the head of the table, his presence filling the room like a thundercloud. "I have prayed on this matter," he announced, setting down his spoon with deliberate precision. God demands discipline, Grace. You will be sent away to learn humility. The words hit her like a physical blow. Father, no, she pleaded, her voice cracking. Please don't separate me from Luke. He's all I have. That's precisely the problem, Reverend Silas replied coldly. Your attachment to the boy has made you forget your duty to God. A period of separation will help you remember your proper priorities. But Grandpa, Luke spoke up, his young voice trembling. I need my mommy. What you need, child, is to see proper Christian behavior modeled, Reverend Silas responded, his tone softening slightly but remaining firm. Your mother has lost her way, and it's my duty as both her father and her pastor to correct her path. Grace reached across the table for her son's hand, but Reverend Silas cleared his throat disapprovingly, and she withdrew. The rest of the meal passed in silence, broken only by the occasional muffled sob from Luke. That night, Grace lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the crickets chirping outside her window. The thought of being separated from Luke felt like a physical pain in her chest. She had already lost her husband. How could she bear to lose her son, too? But she knew her father's word was final. It had been that way since she was a child herself. The next morning dawned gray and cool. Grace stood at the kitchen window, mechanically washing breakfast dishes while Luke sat at the table, pushing his cereal around in its bowl. The sound of an engine broke the morning quiet, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Grace dried her hands and moved to the window. A pickup truck had pulled into the churchyard next door, its black paint dusty from the road. The driver cut the engine, and in the sudden silence, Grace watched as a man climbed out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a leather jacket despite the warming morning air. Even from a distance, she could see the tattoos that covered his exposed forearms. Her father appeared from the church office, and Grace watched as he approached the stranger. There was something both menacing and magnetic about the man's presence, something that made Grace's heart beat a little faster with both fear and curiosity. "Who is that, Mommy?" Luke had abandoned his cereal to join her at the window. "I don't know, sweetheart," she answered truthfully, watching as her father gestured towards the church while speaking to the stranger. The man nodded once, his movements controlled and deliberate. Grace didn't know it then, but she was looking at Ryder Kane, a man who would soon change everything she thought she knew about judgment, redemption, and the true meaning of faith. She stood there at the window, one arm around Luke's shoulders, watching as her father led the mysterious stranger into the church. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the churchyard, and Grace couldn't shake the feeling that her world was about to shift in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The events of yesterday's public shame still stung fresh in her mind, but somehow, the appearance of this stranger seemed to mark a turning point, though whether for better or worse, she couldn't yet tell. She hugged Luke closer, breathing in the sweet smell of his hair, knowing that whatever came next, she would face it with the quiet strength that had carried her through every other trial in her life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the churchyard as Reverend Silas led Grace and Luke toward the weathered pickup truck. Her father's hand gripped her elbow with unnecessary force, his fingers digging into her flesh through her thin cotton dress. "Brother Kane," Reverend Silas announced, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he used from the pulpit. "This is my daughter Grace. As we discussed, she's in need of correction and guidance." Grace's heart hammered in her chest as she studied the stranger. Up close, Ryder Kane was even more imposing. Well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and arms marked with faded tattoos. His face bore the weathered look of someone who'd lived a hard life, with deep lines around his eyes and a jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. "She's grown rebellious," her father continued, his words sharp as knives. "Lazy, won't work, squanders money meant for the Lord's work." Each accusation felt like another stone added to the weight crushing Grace's spirit. Luke's small hand tightened around hers. "That's not true," he whispered, but Grace squeezed his hand, silently willing him to stay quiet. Ryder's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his dark eyes as he looked from Grace to Luke, then back to the Reverend. "You said nothing about a child," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The boy needs to learn proper discipline as well," Reverend Silas declared. "His mother's poor example has affected him deeply." Tears burned behind Grace's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She'd learned long ago that crying only made her father's judgment harsher. "Get in the truck," Reverend Silas commanded, pushing Grace forward. She stumbled slightly, and Ryder's hand shot out to steady her. His touch was surprisingly gentle, gone as quickly as it had come. Grace helped Luke into the truck's cab first, then climbed in herself, her legs feeling like lead. The leather seat was cracked and worn, but clean. The whole vehicle smelled of motor oil and something else, maybe pine air freshener. Ryder walked around to the driver's side, and Grace noticed he moved with a slight limp. As he settled behind the wheel, she caught a glimpse of genuine discomfort in his expression, not at her presence, but at the entire situation. "Sister Grace," her father said through the open window, his voice stern. "I pray this time of correction will bring you back to the path of righteousness." Grace couldn't respond. Her throat felt too tight, constricted by fear and betrayal. How could her own father hand her over to a complete stranger? As they pulled away from the church, Luke pressed against her side, his small body trembling. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though nothing felt okay at all. They drove in silence for several minutes before Ryder spoke, his voice quieter than she expected. "The boy stays with you," he said simply. "I won't separate a mother from her child." Relief flooded through Grace so strongly she nearly gasped. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. The drive stretched on for almost an hour, taking them deeper into rural country. They passed fewer and fewer houses, the landscape opening up into rolling fields and patches of woodland. Luke had fallen asleep against her arm, worn out from fear and emotion. Ryder didn't speak again until they turned onto a gravel road. "Home's just up ahead," he said, gesturing toward a weathered farmhouse that appeared around the next bend. The property was unlike anything Grace had ever seen. Scattered around the yard were various motorcycles in different stages of repair, their chrome and steel parts catching the afternoon sun. Several dogs of various breeds and sizes lounged in the shade of an old oak tree, their heads lifting with interest as the truck approached. The house itself was small but solid-looking, with a wide front porch and faded blue paint. It needed work. The gutters were sagging in places, and one of the shutters hung crooked, but it didn't feel neglected so much as lived in. Ryder parked the truck and cut the engine. "Dogs are all rescues," he said, noticing Grace's nervous glance at the animals. "They're friendly. Won't hurt you or the boy." As if to prove his point, a golden retriever with a graying muzzle ambled over to greet them as they climbed out of the truck. Luke, now awake, reached out tentatively to pet the dog's head. "That's Sarah," Ryder said, the faintest hint of warmth creeping into his voice. "She's the welcome wagon." He led them into the house, which was sparse but clean. The furniture was old but well-maintained, and sunlight streamed through windows that had been recently washed. It smelled of coffee and wood polish, not at all what Grace had expected. "I'll show you your rooms," Ryder said, leading them up a narrow staircase. "Bathroom's at the end of the hall. Kitchen's always open if you're hungry." He showed Luke to a small room with twin beds. "Thought the boy might like to choose which bed he wants," he explained, almost apologetically. Grace's room was next door, similarly furnished but with a single larger bed and a wooden rocking chair by the window. "Listen," Ryder said, standing in the doorway while Grace and Luke took in their new surroundings. "I don't know what your father told you, but you're not prisoners here. You want to leave, you can leave. Though," he paused, scratching his scarred cheek, "I reckon you don't have anywhere else to go or you wouldn't be here in the first place." Grace shook her head slowly, the truth of his words sinking in like lead weights. "Well then," he continued, "we'll figure something out. Get some rest. Been a hard day." After he left, Grace sat in the rocking chair, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Luke curled up on her lap, though he was really too big for it now. "Mommy," he whispered, "why did Grandpa send us away?" Grace stroked his hair, fighting back tears. "I don't know, baby," she admitted. "I just don't know." As the room grew darker, Grace bowed her head in prayer. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice trembling, "why would my father do this? How could he hand us over to a stranger?" She paused, listening to the distant sound of dogs barking and the creak of floorboards as Ryder moved around downstairs. "Please watch over us, Lord. Please keep us safe." Through the window she could see Ryder in the yard, tossing feed to chickens she hadn't noticed before. His movements were methodical, practiced. Not the actions of a cruel man, but not necessarily those of a kind one either. He remained a mystery, this scarred, tattooed man who had promised to keep her son with her, who had told her she was free to leave even though they both knew she had nowhere to go. Morning crept into Grace's room like a shy visitor, casting gentle rays through the thin curtains. The unfamiliar sounds of barking dogs and metallic clinks pulled her from a restless sleep. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back like a wave. She sat up slowly, her hands smoothing over the worn but clean quilt. Luke was still asleep in the next room. She could hear his soft breathing through the thin wall. The clock on the bedside table read 6:30 in the morning. More mechanical sounds drifted up from outside. Grace moved to the window, drawing the curtain aside carefully. In the yard below, she could see a large garage she hadn't noticed yesterday. The wide doors stood open, and inside, sparks flew as someone worked. After washing up and dressing, Grace went downstairs. The kitchen was empty but showed signs of recent use, a coffee pot still half full, a plate with crumbs. Through the screen door, she could see Ryder in his workshop, bent over what looked like a motorcycle frame. Curiosity drew her closer, though anxiety made her steps hesitant. She paused in the garage doorway, watching as Ryder worked. That's when she noticed it, the prosthetic arm he used with practiced ease as he managed the welding torch. The metal gleamed dully in the morning light, its mechanisms clicking softly as he moved. A radio played quietly in the corner, mostly static and country music. But then a news segment cut through, making Grace freeze. Local veteran and ex-Hell's Angel who served time for assault continues his work with disabled veterans. The announcer's voice crackled through the speaker before Ryder reached over and switched it off. He must have sensed her presence because he turned then, lifting his welding mask. "Morning," he said simply, as if he hadn't heard the radio's damning words. "Coffee's still hot if you want some." Grace couldn't find her voice to respond. An ex-Hell's Angel? Prison time for assault? Her father had handed her and Luke over to a convicted criminal? Before she could process this new information, the dogs started barking again. Ryder set down his tools and walked past her, heading to a large bin near the house. She watched as he measured out food for each dog, calling them by name: Sarah, Max, Bruno, Lady. Each one waited patiently for their turn, tails wagging as Ryder scratched behind their ears. The screen door creaked, and Luke appeared, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Good morning, sir," he said politely to Ryder. Ryder nodded at the boy. "There's fresh muffins on the counter," he said, jerking his thumb towards the kitchen. "Help yourself." Luke's face lit up, and he hurried inside. Grace followed, torn between maternal instinct to check the food herself and not wanting to appear ungrateful. But Ryder had already turned back to his dogs, giving them fresh water and checking their bedding. The muffins turned out to be store-bought, but fresh, still soft, and slightly warm. Luke bit into one happily, while Grace made herself busy examining the kitchen. It was clean but showed signs of bachelor living. Mismatched plates, a drawer that stuck, coffee rings on the counter. When Ryder came back inside, he poured himself more coffee and sat at the small kitchen table. "Might as well tell you," he said, his voice gruff but steady. "Since you probably heard the radio, I'm part of a rehabilitation program. Build custom bikes for disabled vets. Part of my parole requirements, but..." He shrugged his prosthetic shoulder. "Turns out I'm good at it. Helps them get back some independence." Grace found herself nodding, her hands automatically reaching for a dishcloth to wipe down the counter. The familiar motion helped calm her nerves. "The kitchen could use some organizing," she said softly, then immediately worried she'd offended him. But Ryder just looked around as if seeing the space through new eyes. "Suppose it could," he agreed. Then, after a pause, "Thank you." Those two quiet words, spoken with simple sincerity, made Grace pause in her cleaning. She glanced at him, but he was already standing, rinsing his cup in the sink. "Got parts to finish welding," he said. "Make yourselves at home." He headed back to the garage, leaving Grace and Luke to settle into their morning routine. The day passed in a blur of small discoveries, finding out where things were kept, learning the dogs' personalities, watching Luke gradually relax enough to play in the yard under the watchful eyes of Sarah, the golden retriever. That night, storm clouds rolled in, bringing with them the low rumble of thunder. Grace had just drifted off when Luke's cry pierced the darkness. She was halfway to his room when she realized Ryder had gotten there first. She stopped in the doorway, watching as Ryder sat quietly in a chair beside Luke's bed. He didn't touch the boy or offer empty comfort, but his presence seemed to steady Luke, who was shaking from his nightmare. "Was about Dad again," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. "About the accident." Ryder nodded, his silence somehow more comforting than words would have been. The thunder rolled again, but Luke didn't flinch this time. "Sometimes," Ryder said finally, his voice low and careful, "the hardest storms are the ones inside our heads." Luke considered this, his small face serious in the dim light. "Do you have storms in your head too, sir?" "Sometimes," Ryder admitted. "But they pass, like real storms do." Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, feeling tears well up. This man, this supposed monster her father had condemned, sat with such gentle patience beside her son's bed. No demands, no judgment, just quiet understanding. Luke's eyes began to droop, the nightmare's grip loosening. Still, Ryder sat there, a steady guardian until Luke's breathing evened out in sleep. Only then did he stand, moving carefully to avoid creaking floorboards. He noticed Grace in the doorway but didn't seem surprised to see her. Their eyes met briefly in the darkness, and something shifted in Grace's heart, the first tentative seed of trust taking root where fear had been. Without a word, Ryder moved past her in the hallway, his footsteps fading as he returned to his own room. Grace remained in Luke's doorway a moment longer, watching her son sleep peacefully now, the storm rolling away into the distance. In that quiet moment, she realized that perhaps the most dangerous assumptions were the ones that labeled people as monsters without knowing their hearts. Her father had taught her to fear this man, but in less than 2 days, he had shown more genuine kindness than the Reverend had in years. The thunder rumbled one last time, distant now, like an echo of her former fears growing fainter by the moment. Grace returned to her room, but sleep was slow to come as she pondered the complex nature of the man who had been thrust into their lives, not as their jailer, but perhaps, unexpectedly, as their protector. Over the next few days, the old farmhouse began to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Grace found herself falling into a comfortable routine, her hands busy with the satisfying work of bringing order to chaos. The kitchen sparkled now, organized with the precision that came naturally to her. She discovered a strange peace in the simple tasks, folding laundry that smelled of sunshine, arranging mismatched plates in neat rows, sweeping away years of bachelor living from forgotten corners. Ryder's office particularly needed attention. Stacks of invoices and receipts teetered precariously on every surface, threatening to avalanche at the slightest breeze. Grace offered to help sort them one morning, and Ryder's relief was obvious in the way his shoulders relaxed. "Been meaning to get to those," he admitted, running a hand through his graying hair. "Numbers ain't exactly my strong suit." Grace settled at the desk, creating neat piles by date and category. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice the names repeating on the invoices. Local veterans, each one getting custom modifications for their motorcycles. The notes in Ryder's rough handwriting showed careful attention to their specific needs. Lower handlebars for Jim's shoulder. Extra support on left side for Mike's prosthetic. Through the window, she could see Luke in the yard, carefully throwing a ball for Sarah. The golden retriever bounded after it with endless enthusiasm, while Ryder's other dogs lounged in sunny spots nearby. Luke's laughter drifted in on the breeze, a sound she hadn't heard nearly enough lately. Veterans started dropping by throughout the day, each greeting Ryder with quiet respect. They'd gather in the garage, talking in low voices about modifications and adjustments. Grace watched how Ryder listened intently to each one, his hand steady on their bikes as they spoke about their struggles with civilian life. One afternoon, a young man with a prosthetic leg similar to Ryder's arrived. His hands shook as he tried to mount his bike, frustration evident in every movement. Ryder worked with him for hours, adjusting and readjusting until the veteran could ride smoothly. When the young man finally managed a successful test run around the property, his smile was brilliant. "See?" Ryder said quietly. "Just needed the right setup. You'll be back on the road in no time." The gratitude in the veteran's eyes spoke volumes. Grace understood then that this wasn't just rehabilitation. It was restoration of dignity, one bike at a time. When supplies ran low, Grace made a list for a grocery run into town. Ryder handed her the keys to his old pickup truck without hesitation, trust implicit in the gesture. The familiar streets of town felt different now, viewed from outside the suffocating bubble of her father's influence. But the whispers started as soon as she entered the grocery store. They followed her down every aisle, carried on glances and half-hidden sneers. "Living with that ex-con?" Her poor father, such shame. Living in sin, plain as day. That biker criminal. Mrs. Peterson, who'd sat in the front pew every Sunday for 30 years, made a point of steering her cart away when Grace approached. 2 women by the produce section crossed themselves as she passed. The checkout girl barely looked at her, dropping her change on the counter instead of placing it in her hand. Grace's hands shook as she loaded the groceries into the truck. Tears threatened, but she held them back until she was safely on the road home. The judgment felt like stones against her skin, not physical, but bruising nonetheless. When she arrived back at the farmhouse, Ryder was in his usual spot in the garage. He took one look at her face and set down his wrench. "Town gave you trouble," he said. It wasn't a question. Grace nodded, wiping at her eyes. They're saying that you're living in sin with an ex-con?" Ryder's voice was matter-of-fact, without bitterness. "Let 'em talk. Words only have the power we give them." That evening, after Luke was asleep, Grace found herself sitting by the fireplace with Ryder. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly. The quiet felt safe, inviting truth. "My brother Danny," Ryder began suddenly, his voice rough with memory. "He was always the wild one. I followed him into the gang life, thinking I could protect him." He stared into the fire. "There was a drug deal. Went bad. Danny took a bullet meant for me." Grace's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "Is that when I lost my arm?" "Yeah, same night, after Danny." He swallowed hard. "I lost it. Put 3 men in the hospital. That's what got me 15 years. The flames crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, a dog barked at something in the darkness. "I ain't proud of who I was," Ryder continued. "Anger ate me up inside for years. Then one day this prison chaplain, different from your father's type, he talked to me about grace. Real grace, not the kind that comes with conditions." He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting firelight. "Started working with my hands, learning to build instead of destroy, trying to build something decent before I go." Grace thought about her father's version of faith, rigid, demanding, quick to condemn. She thought about the way he wielded scripture like a weapon, cutting down any sign of weakness or questioning. "My father," she said softly, "he always said faith was about obedience, about being perfect, but I could never be perfect enough." Ryder was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words were gentle but firm. "Then maybe it's time you learned what mercy really feels like." The simple truth of his words broke something loose inside her. Grace found herself crying, not the frightened tears of recent days, but deep, cleansing sobs that felt like release. Here, in this unlikely place, with this unlikely man, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. She understood suddenly that her father's punishment had become her liberation. In sending her away, he had unknowingly given her the space to breathe, to question, to begin healing. The tears that fell now were washing away years of judgment and fear, leaving behind a tentative hope. Ryder didn't move to comfort her or offer empty platitudes. He simply sat with her in the firelight, a steady presence as she began to understand that sometimes salvation comes in unexpected packages, and mercy can wear a leather jacket and carry the scars of a hard-lived life. The early morning sun painted long shadows across Ryder's workshop as Grace tied her hair back with a faded bandana. A week had passed since their honest conversation by the fire, and something had shifted in the atmosphere of the old farmhouse. The air felt lighter somehow, despite the heavy scent of paint that filled the workshop. "You sure you want to help?" Ryder asked, setting up 2 paint rollers. "It's going to be messy work." Grace picked up a roller, testing its weight in her hand. "I'm not afraid of a little mess anymore." Through the workshop's open doors, she could see Luke racing through the tall grass, 3 dogs bounding after him. His laughter carried on the morning breeze, clear and uninhibited. It was the first real laugh she'd heard from him since they'd arrived, and the sound made her heart swell. "Look at him go," Ryder said softly, following her gaze. Those mutts of mine sure love that boy." They worked side by side, transforming the weathered walls from a dingy gray to a clean white. Grace found herself humming as she painted, old hymns her mother used to sing before she passed. Songs of grace and redemption that felt different now, freed from her father's harsh interpretation. "That's nice," Ryder commented, dipping his roller. "What you're humming reminds me of something from way back." Grace smiled. "Amazing Grace, my mother's favorite." "Fitting name for you," he said quietly, then quickly turned back to his work. By midday, they'd finished the first coat. While waiting for it to dry, Ryder called Luke over. The boy came running, his cheeks flushed from play, the dogs trailing behind him. "Want to learn something useful?" Ryder asked, gesturing to his truck. Luke's eyes lit up. "Yes, sir." Grace watched as Ryder patiently showed Luke how to change a tire, explaining each step, with careful detail. Her son's face was serious with concentration as he helped loosen the lug nuts with a wrench almost as long as his arm. "That's it, buddy," Ryder encouraged. "Lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. Remember that, and you'll never go wrong." Later that evening, as Grace set the table for dinner, she noticed Ryder hanging back awkwardly. "Everything okay?" she asked. He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "Been meaning to ask, that prayer thing you do before eating, would it be all right if... I haven't since I was a kid, but..." Grace's heart softened. "Would you like to learn?" He nodded, almost shy. Might be good for Luke to see. That night, Grace taught Ryder a simple grace before meals. His large hands felt rough against hers as they joined in prayer, but there was a gentleness in his touch that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. The days began to take on a rhythm. Grace cooked real meals now, not just the hurried sandwiches of their first days. The kitchen filled with the aroma of fresh bread and hearty soups. She found joy in caring for others when it came from choice, rather than obligation. Sunday morning arrived bright and clear. Luke sat cross-legged on the porch, his face thoughtful as he watched the sunrise. "Can we pray for Grandpa?" he asked suddenly. Grace sat beside him, her heart catching. "What would you like to pray for?" "For his heart to get softer," Luke said simply, like in the Bible story about the stone turning into flesh. Grace pulled him close, feeling both hope and heartache mingle in her chest. "That's a beautiful prayer, sweetheart." That evening, after Luke had gone to bed, Grace found Ryder sitting on the porch steps. The night was warm, filled with cricket song and distant dog barks. "Thank you," he said as she sat beside him. "For what?" "For bringing light back into this house." He gestured vaguely at the farmhouse behind them. "Used to be this place only heard cussing and engines. Now it's got laughter, got prayer, got life again." Grace studied his profile in the gathering dusk. The man before her wasn't the fearsome ex-con she'd first imagined. His scars and tattoos told a story of redemption, not condemnation. She saw now a man who'd found his way back to Grace through acts of kindness, who taught broken veterans to rebuild their lives alongside broken machines. The crickets sang their evening chorus as they sat in comfortable silence. A gentle breeze carried the scent of summer grass and distant rain. In this moment, Grace realized that sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as trials, and that true redemption often looks nothing like we expect. Luke's laughter echoed from an upstairs window, where he was probably reading with his flashlight again. One of the dogs trotted up to lay at their feet, and Grace felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Here, in this unlikely sanctuary, she'd found something she never expected. Not just shelter, but healing. Ryder's presence beside her felt solid and reassuring, Like an anchor in a storm, she hadn't known she was still fighting. The way he looked at her now held none of the judgment she'd grown accustomed to, only understanding and something warmer she wasn't ready to name. The evening stars began to appear, one by one, like tiny promises in the darkening sky. Grace remembered her father's words about this place being a punishment and felt a smile tugging at her lips. If this was punishment, then perhaps she'd misunderstood the nature of grace all along. Back in town, Reverend Silas Delaney paced his study, his face twisted with anger as he listened to the latest gossip about his daughter. Mrs. Peterson from the Ladies' Aid Society had just left, after sharing what she'd seen at the grocery store. Grace, shopping with that tattooed ex-convict, looking entirely too comfortable in his presence. The Reverend's fingers trembled as he pulled out his worn Bible. "The wages of sin is death," he muttered, marking the passage for Sunday's sermon. His righteous anger burned hotter with each passing day. When Sunday morning arrived, the church pews filled as usual. Reverend Silas stood at his pulpit, his stern gaze sweeping across the congregation. The morning light filtered through stained glass, casting colored shadows across his face. "Today," he began, his voice sharp as a knife, "we speak of sin and its consequences." His knuckles whitened around the pulpit's edge. "When members of our own flock stray from God's path, living in sin with known criminals, bringing shame upon their families." The congregation stirred uncomfortably as he continued, his words growing more pointed. "My own daughter, Grace Delaney, has chosen to live unmarried with a man of violence, flying in the face of all decency." Whispers rippled through the church. Sarah Miller, sitting in her usual pew, felt her heart ache for her friend. She'd known Grace since high school, had stood by her through her husband's death. This public shaming was the last straw. After the service, the churchyard buzzed with gossip. Living with that biker? Such a shame. And with her little boy there, too. Sarah couldn't bear it anymore. She drove straight to Ryder's farm, gravel crunching under her tires as she pulled up to the house. Grace was hanging laundry in the yard, looking more peaceful than Sarah had seen her in years, despite everything. "Grace," Sarah called out, hurrying across the yard. "We need to talk." Grace's smile faded at her friend's worried expression. They sat at the kitchen table while Luke played outside with the dogs. Sarah wrapped her hands around a cup of coffee, struggling with what she needed to say. "Your father," Sarah began, her voice tight. "He's planning to report Ryder for parole violation. He's claiming Ryder's harboring you against your will." Grace's face went pale. "But that's not true. I chose to stay. Ryder's never—" "I know," Sarah said softly. "But your father's determined to destroy this peace you've found." Neither woman noticed Ryder standing in the doorway, his expression dark with concern. He'd heard enough. That evening, after Sarah left and Luke was asleep, Ryder found Grace sitting on the porch swing. "You should take Luke and go," he said quietly, keeping his distance. "I know some people few hours south. They'd help you start fresh." Grace stood up, moonlight silvering her hair. "No," she said firmly. "I'm done running." "Grace," Ryder's voice was rough with emotion. "Your father could cause real trouble. My parole. Then we'll face it together." She stepped closer to him. "You're not my punishment, Ryder. You're my second chance." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ryder's hands, calloused and strong, trembled slightly as he looked at her. "I ain't good enough for you," he whispered. "That's not for you to decide," Grace answered softly. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the dark sky. A warm breeze carried the scent of summer flowers and fresh-cut grass. In the distance, crickets played their evening symphony. Ryder stood still as Grace moved closer, Slowly, carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal, she wrapped her arms around his waist. He stayed frozen for a moment, then gradually relaxed, his good arm coming up to hold her gently. They stood there under the starlight, sharing their first real embrace. It wasn't passionate or dramatic, just quiet, full of respect and unspoken affection. Grace rested her head against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat. Ryder's chin settled softly on top of her head, his breath evening out as tension slowly left his body. No words were needed in that moment. The night wrapped around them like a protective blanket, crickets singing their gentle lullaby. In the distance, one of the dogs barked softly, and a whippoorwill called from the darkness. Grace felt years of fear and judgment melting away in the warmth of Ryder's embrace. His strength wasn't threatening anymore. It was protective, gentle, like the way he handled injured animals or taught Luke about engines. She could feel his heartbeat gradually slowing to match hers, their breathing falling into the same rhythm. The porch light cast a soft glow around them, moths dancing in its beam. From upstairs came the faint sound of Luke turning over in his sleep, safe and secure in his bed. The moment stretched out, peaceful and pure, neither of them willing to be the first to step away. In this quiet embrace, they both found something they'd been missing. Not just comfort, but acceptance. Understanding. The promise of something deeper than either had dared to hope for. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but for now, under the vast star-lit sky, they stood together, two souls finding shelter in each other's strength. The summer morning started like any other at Ryder's workshop. The air smelled of metal and motor, oil, mixed with the sweet scent of wild honeysuckle growing along the fence. Ryder was bent over his workbench, focused on adjusting the carburetor of a veteran's motorcycle, when he noticed the folded paper tucked under his toolbox. His hands, usually steady and sure, trembled slightly as he opened the note. The message, scrawled in harsh black ink, made his blood run cold. "Found you, traitor. The Iron Sons don't forget. We'll finish what prison didn't." Ryder's jaw clenched as memories flooded back. Nights of violence, the federal investigation, his testimony that had put several gang members behind bars. He crumpled the note and shoved it deep into his jacket pocket, glancing toward the house where Grace was hanging laundry, Luke playing with the dogs nearby. Over the next few days, Ryder threw himself into work, staying late in the shop and double-checking every lock. He installed new security lights around the property and kept the dogs closer to the house at night. Grace noticed the change in him, the way his shoulders tensed at unexpected sounds, how his eyes constantly scanned the road during their evening meals. "Everything okay?" she asked one evening, touching his arm gently as he prepared to head back to the workshop. "Just busy," he answered, not meeting her eyes. "Got some rush orders to finish." But Grace saw the worry lines deepening around his mouth, the dark circles under his eyes growing darker. He was pulling away, building walls she thought they'd torn down. It hurt, but she trusted him enough to wait until he was ready to talk. The truth came out on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. Luke was helping Ryder organize tools, chattering about his latest book from the library, when he knocked over a stack of papers. As he gathered them up, a wrinkled note fell from between invoices. "Mr. Ryder," Luke's voice wavered, "what's the Iron Sons?" Ryder's head snapped up, his face draining of color. But before he could respond, Grace appeared in the doorway, having heard Luke's question. Her eyes met Ryder's, and she saw fear there, not for himself, but for them. "Luke, honey," she said softly, "would you please go check on the dogs? Make sure their water bowls are full?" Once Luke was out of earshot, Grace picked up the threatening note. Her hands shook as she read it, but her voice was steady when she spoke. How long have you known about this?" Ryder ran his hand over his face, suddenly looking tired. "About a week. Didn't want to worry you and the boy." "So you've been carrying this burden alone?" Grace stepped closer, laying her hand on his workbench. "Pushing us away to protect us?" "Grace, these men—" Ryder's voice was rough with emotion. "They're dangerous. What I did, testifying against them, it got some of their leaders locked up for 20 years. They don't forgive that kind of betrayal." "Tell me everything," Grace said quietly, pulling up a shop stool. For the next hour, Ryder talked. He told her about his younger days with the gang, about his brother's death that had opened his eyes to the destruction they caused. He explained how he'd worked with law enforcement to bring down the worst offenders, and how that decision had earned him both a reduced sentence and a death threat. "I thought I'd left it all behind," he finished, staring at his hands. "Should have known better. Should have known they'd eventually track me down." Grace was quiet for a moment, processing everything. Then she reached out and took his hand, both the flesh one and the prosthetic one, holding them firmly in hers. "Listen to me, Ryder Kane," she said, her voice full of quiet strength. "You're not alone anymore. Whatever comes, we face it together." "I can't put you and Luke in danger," he protested, trying to pull away. But Grace held on. "We're already in this with you. Pushing us away won't protect us. It'll just leave all of us more vulnerable." She took a deep breath. "Remember what you told me when I first came here? That maybe it was time I learned what mercy really feels like? Well, maybe it's time you learned what family feels like." Tears gathered in Ryder's eyes, though he blinked them away quickly. Grace stood up, still holding his hands, and began to pray. "Dear Lord," her voice trembled but grew stronger with each word, "we ask for your protection over this home and over Ryder. You know his heart, how he's worked to make amends, how he helps others rebuild their lives. Watch over him, guide him, shield him from those who wish him harm. Give us all the strength and wisdom we need to face whatever comes. In Jesus' name, amen." When she finished, Ryder pulled her into a tight embrace, his face buried in her hair. They stood like that for several minutes, drawing strength from each other, until Luke's voice called from outside about dinner being ready. That evening, they ate together as usual, but something had shifted. The tension in Ryder's eyes had eased, replaced by a quiet determination. He helped Luke with his homework, listened to him read a chapter from his book, and for the first time in days, truly smiled. As night fell, they sat on the porch, watching fireflies dance in the darkness. Luke had gone to bed, and the only sounds were crickets and the occasional bark from the dogs. The peace was shattered by the sudden flash of headlights at their gate, bright beams sweeping across the property before disappearing down the road. Ryder's arm tightened around Grace's shoulders, and she felt him go still, like a soldier sensing approaching battle. The dogs started barking, their voices echoing in the darkness. The peaceful evening had transformed into something more ominous, a reminder that their time of safety might be running out. But Grace wasn't afraid, not anymore. She leaned into Ryder's strength, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady against her cheek. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The Lord had brought them this far. He wouldn't abandon them now. The night was thick and heavy when the first rock crashed through the kitchen window. Grace jolted awake at the sound of shattering glass, her heart pounding. In the darkness, she heard Ryder's heavy footsteps rushing down the hallway. "Get Luke!" he shouted. "Stay in the back bedroom." Through the window, orange light flickered ominously. The acrid smell of gasoline and smoke filled the air. Grace ran to Luke's room, finding him already awake and frightened. "Mama?" His voice trembled as she scooped him up. "It's okay, baby. We're going to be fine." She hurried him to the master bedroom at the rear of the house, her arms tight around his small frame. Through the window, she could see flames beginning to lick at the workshop walls, casting demonic shadows across the yard. Outside, engines roared and men shouted. The dogs barked frantically from their kennels. Grace heard the distinct sound of motorcycle boots on gravel, then Ryder's voice rising above the chaos. "This is between us," he called out. "Leave my family out of it." The word family made Grace's heart clench. She held Luke closer, whispering prayers as the sounds of fighting erupted. Through the bedroom window, she could see multiple figures in the firelight. Ryder was outnumbered 4-1. The first punch landed with a sickening thud. Grace covered Luke's ears as he buried his face in her shoulder. She watched helplessly as the men surrounded Ryder, their fists and boots finding their mark again and again. Despite his size and strength, Ryder was overwhelmed. The fire in the workshop grew higher, casting everything in hellish light. The heat was becoming intense, even through the closed windows. Then Grace heard something that made her blood run cold, a scream of pain from inside the burning building. "Help! I'm trapped!" The voice was young, panicked. Grace saw Ryder try to move toward the workshop, but two men held him back, still throwing punches. Without thinking, she kissed Luke's forehead. "Stay here, baby. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me or Ryder." "Mama, no!" Luke grabbed at her shirt. "I have to help," she said firmly. "Remember what we read in church? Perfect love casts out fear. I'll be right back." She ran from the room, hearing Luke's sob as he locked the door behind her. The heat hit her like a wall as she burst out of the house. The workshop was nearly engulfed now, flames reaching toward the sky. "Help!" The voice came again, weaker this time. Grace ran toward the building, ducking under a wild swing from one of the attackers. She could see a figure through the flames, trapped behind some fallen machinery. The heat was unbearable, but she pushed forward, grabbing a piece of metal to move debris aside. Pain seared through her palms, but she didn't let go. "Take my hand," she screamed through the smoke. The trapped man, barely more than a boy, reached for her. His leather jacket was smoking, his face streaked with soot and terror. Grace pulled with all her strength, ignoring the agony in her burned hands. Together they stumbled out of the inferno just as part of the roof collapsed. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. The other gang members were already mounting their bikes, leaving their injured companion behind. Grace helped the young man to safety, then ran to where Ryder lay on the ground. His face was bloody, but his eyes were clear as they met hers. "You okay?" he asked, trying to sit up. "I'm fine," she assured him, though her hands were beginning to blister. "Stay still until help comes." Sheriff Weaver's cruiser skidded into the yard, followed by fire trucks and an ambulance. The firefighters immediately began battling the blaze, but it was clear half the workshop was already lost. The young man Grace had saved sat nearby, coughing and shaking. When Sheriff Weaver approached him with handcuffs, Ryder spoke up. "Wait." His voice was rough but firm. "No charges." "Ryder," the sheriff protested, "they tried to kill you. If we answer hate with hate, we'll never heal." Ryder's eyes found Grace's. "Sometimes the bravest thing is to forgive." The young man looked at them in disbelief. "Why would you help me, after what we did?" Grace knelt beside him, her burned hands cradled in her lap. "Because that's what love does. It saves people who don't deserve it. It's what saved me, and it's what saved Ryder too." Emergency workers swarmed around them. Grace's hands were wrapped in gauze, and Ryder's cuts were cleaned and bandaged. Luke was brought out once the scene was secure, throwing himself into his mother's arms with tears streaming down his face. As dawn broke over the horizon, the last of the emergency vehicles departed. Smoke still rose from the wreckage of the workshop, but the fire was out. The air smelled of wet ash and scorched metal. Grace sat beside Ryder on the porch steps, gently cleaning a cut on his forehead that the paramedics had missed. His good hand found hers, careful of the bandages. "You saved them," he whispered. "And me." His voice was thick with emotion. "Running into that fire, you could have died." "I couldn't let him die," she said simply. "Not even after what they did. That's not who we are anymore." The rising sun painted the sky in soft pinks and golds. Where the sound of sirens had filled the night, morning birds now began their songs. Luke slept peacefully on the porch swing, exhausted from the night's events. In the quiet dawn, Grace and Ryder sat together, watching the sun rise over the ashes of the workshop. The destruction was extensive, but as Grace looked at their joined hands, she knew this fire had burned away more than just buildings. It had consumed the last remnants of their shame, their fear, their past. Like a crucible, it had refined them, revealing the pure gold of who they truly were. The last of the emergency lights faded into the distance, and the morning birdsong grew stronger, as if nature itself was declaring that even from devastation, new beginnings could emerge. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room made Grace's eyes water as she watched Ryder's chest rise and fall. Tubes and wires connected him to beeping machines, their steady rhythm a reminder that he was still fighting. The doctors had said the smoke inhalation was severe, and the beating he'd taken had left 3 cracked ribs and a mild concussion. Luke sat cross-legged in the visitor's chair, his small finger tracing the words in his children's Bible. "Mom, can I read Psalm 23 again? I think Mr. Ryder likes that one." Grace smiled softly. "Of course, sweetheart." She adjusted Ryder's blanket, her bandaged hands still tender from the burns. "The Lord is my shepherd," Luke began, his young voice clear in the quiet room. "I shall not want—" A gentle knock interrupted the reading. Sarah, Grace's friend from church, stood in the doorway, her face drawn with worry. "Grace, can we talk outside for a minute?" Grace kissed Luke's forehead. "Keep reading to Mr. Ryder, honey. I'll be right back." In the hallway, Sarah wrung her hands. "Your father, he's filed a report with Child Protective Services. He's claiming you're endangering Luke by living with Ryder." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Grace's feet. "What?" "He's using the gang attack as evidence. Says it proves Ryder's criminal past puts Luke at risk." Sarah touched Grace's arm. "A social worker is coming today." Grace steadied herself against the wall. "Today? But I can't." "Mrs. Delaney?" A woman in a crisp blazer approached, holding a manila folder. "I'm Margaret Wells from CPS. We need to discuss your living situation." The next hour passed in a blur of questions. About Ryder's criminal record, about the fire, about Luke's schooling and daily routine. Grace answered everything truthfully, her voice growing hoarser with each response. "Until we complete our investigation," Ms. Wells concluded, "we believe it's in Luke's best interest to stay with his grandfather." "No," Grace whispered. "Please, my father, he's not what people think. He uses religion to control." "Reverend Delaney is a respected member of the community," Ms. Wells interrupted. "He can provide a stable environment during this transition period." Grace watched helplessly as the social worker entered Ryder's room to explain the situation to Luke. Her son's cry of protest pierced her heart. "Mom, no, I want to stay with you and Mr. Ryder." Luke clung to her waist, tears streaming down his face. "It's just for a little while, baby," Grace choked out, though the words felt like glass in her throat. "Be brave for me, okay? Remember what we read about having faith even when we're scared." Reverend Silas appeared in his black suit, looking every bit the concerned grandfather. "Come along, Luke. We'll get ice cream on the way home." Luke's fingers dug into Grace's shirt. "I don't want ice cream. Mom, please!" It took everything in Grace not to scream as her father led Luke away. The boy's sobs echoed down the hospital corridor, each one a knife to her heart. When the silence finally settled, Grace collapsed into the chair beside Ryder's bed. Her prayers came out broken and raw. "Why?" she whispered, gripping Ryder's hand. "Every time I choose love, I lose it. When Tom died, when Dad turned against me, and now Luke." Her tears fell onto their joined hands. "I tried to do what's right. I tried to show mercy, just like you did, but it keeps costing me everything." "Don't." Ryder's voice was barely audible, rough from the smoke damage. His eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with effort. "Don't give up, Grace." He squeezed her hand weakly. "You taught me that faith ain't about winning. It's about staying." Grace pressed her forehead to their clasped hands, letting his words wash over her. Even now, barely conscious, he was trying to give her strength. She thought of how far they'd both come, from broken people living in fear to souls learning to trust in love again. Through her tears, she began to pray again, this time with Ryder's hand firmly in hers. The hospital machines kept their steady rhythm, marking time as afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting golden stripes across the sterile floor. 3 weeks after the fire, Ryder stood in front of the bathroom mirror, buttoning his cleanest shirt with determination, despite his still healing ribs. Grace watched from the doorway, her heart racing at what they were about to do. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. Ryder's eyes met hers in the reflection. "Ain't nobody gonna keep you from your boy, Grace. It's time we face them together." The drive into town felt endless. Sunday morning sunshine gilded the church steeple as they pulled into the parking lot. Through the windows, Grace could see the congregation settling into their pews, Luke's small figure wedged between her father and a stern-faced deacon. "Ready?" Ryder asked, offering his hand. Grace took it, drawing strength from his calloused palm against hers. Together they walked up the church steps, their footfalls echoing in the morning quiet. The heavy wooden doors creaked as they entered. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the pews like wind through wheat. Luke's face lit up, but Reverend Silas gripped the boy's shoulder, keeping him seated. Grace felt Ryder squeeze her hand as they walked down the center aisle. Her father's face darkened with each step they took. "This is a house of God," Reverend Silas announced, his voice sharp. "Not a place for—" "You're right, Father," Grace interrupted, her voice clear and steady. "This is God's house, so let's speak truth in it." She turned to face the congregation, these people who had watched her grow up, who had judged her silence for weakness. "Many of you were here when my father shamed me for choosing to feed my son instead of filling the collection plate. You watched as he sold me to a stranger as punishment." Her voice caught, but she pressed on. "But God has a way of turning punishment into blessing. The man you whispered about, the one you called dangerous?" She looked at Ryder with tears in her eyes. "He showed me more of Christ's love than I'd seen in years of sermons." The congregation stirred uncomfortably. Several women dabbed at their eyes. "You wanted to break me," Grace said, looking directly at her father now. "But you sent me straight into the arms of grace itself." Reverend Silas gripped the pulpit, his knuckles white, his face contorted with internal struggle as the truth of her words penetrated years of rigid pride. Suddenly, his legs gave way. He collapsed to his knees, his shoulders shaking with sobs. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "Dear God, what have I done? Grace, my Grace, please." Without hesitation, Grace moved forward, kneeling beside her father. She helped him to his feet, just as she had done for so many others. "It's already given," she whispered, embracing him as Luke ran forward to join them. The autumn breeze carried the sound of hammers and saws across Ryder's property. Where charred ruins had stood just weeks ago, hope was rising from the ashes, board by board. Grace watched from the porch as a dozen townspeople worked together, raising the frame of the new garage. Her father, Reverend Silas, was among them, his white shirt sleeves rolled up as he passed lumber to younger men. Luke darted between the workers, carrying water bottles and snacks. The boy had barely left Ryder's side since returning home 3 days ago. The moment they'd gotten custody back, Luke had run straight into Ryder's arms, crying, "I missed you, sir." The memory still brought tears to Grace's eyes. "Look at this," Ryder said softly beside her, gesturing to the scene before them. "Never thought I'd see the day." Veterans from his program stood shoulder to shoulder with church deacons, working in harmony. The same people who had once crossed the street to avoid him now brought casseroles and asked about his prosthetic arm with genuine interest. Just yesterday, 3 more veterans had testified at the town council meeting about how Ryder's program had saved their lives. "He taught us to rebuild ourselves by rebuilding these bikes," one had said, his voice thick with emotion. The council voted unanimously to grant Ryder a business license and waive the permit fees for reconstruction. Reverend Silas approached them, wiping sweat from his brow. His eyes were damp as he looked at his daughter. "Grace," he said, his voice trembling. "These past weeks have shown me how wrong I was. I confused control for faith, punishment for guidance." He reached for her hand. "You taught me what grace really means. Both of you did." Grace squeezed her father's hand, remembering all the years of harsh words and judgment. "God's grace is bigger than our mistakes," she said softly. Together they watched as the community, once divided by prejudice, worked, as one to rebuild not just a garage, but bridges between hearts long separated by fear and misunderstanding. 6 months passed like pages turning in a well-loved book. The new workshop stood proudly against the Kansas sky, its red paint gleaming in the sunlight. A hand-carved wooden sign hung above the entrance, the letters burned deep with care. The Redemption Garage. Inside, the space hummed with purpose. Grace had transformed the office into a welcoming haven, with comfortable chairs and always fresh coffee for the veterans who stopped by. Photos lined the walls, motorcycles before and after restoration, smiling faces of men and women who'd found healing through working with their hands. Luke bounded around after school, his backpack forgotten in the corner as he helped check tire pressure and polish chrome under Ryder's watchful eye. "Hand me that wrench, buddy," Ryder would say, and Luke would beam with pride as he selected the right tool. The veterans came daily now, some to work on bikes, others just to talk. They'd gather around the coffee pot, sharing stories and strength, their laughter mixing with the mechanical sounds from the garage. One particularly beautiful evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Ryder asked Grace to join him on their favorite spot on the porch. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled something from his pocket, a delicate silver ring that caught the fading light. "I ain't good with fancy words," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "But you were never sold to me, Grace. You were sent. By him above, I reckon." He held out the ring, simple and sincere like their love. "Would you stay? Make this official?" Tears sparkled in Grace's eyes as she nodded, unable to speak. Just then, Luke burst through the screen door, his face lighting up at the scene before him. "Dad," he exclaimed, the word falling naturally from his lips for the very first time. "Did she say yes?" Ryder's eyes grew wet as he gathered both Grace and Luke into his arms, holding them close. The 3 of them settled onto the porch swing, hands clasped together, watching as the lights from the garage cast a warm glow across the yard. The illuminated sign stood as a beacon of their journey, a testament to faith renewed, forgiveness given, and hope that would last forever. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.